Welcome to the Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers of Washington and its monthly Author and Creative Showcase. I am your host, Mark Miller. Today I have author Mary Jaffe on a claw hot seat at the Bremerton Kitsap Access Television Studios. I plan on grilling her on her work of historical fiction, Mary Quigley's Da. Welcome, Mary.
Well,
How are you
thank
doing
you.
today?
Great.
At some claw-sponsored events, you have told me some of the stories about how your book came to be. So the first question is, when did you decide to be a writer in the first place?
I didn't decide that. When I was in the second grade, I hated my reading group. I got kicked out, and the teacher said, go in the back and write. Just here's paper, here's pencil. So that's how I spent art, music, reading, and writing were the thing in our families. So I did a lot of writing.
Okay. So what were you doing that was irritating the teacher?
I was helping children who couldn't pronounce their words correctly. And when we got the word cat, I would say, put a B, say bat. It rhymes with that. Sat. And the teacher just gave up. My mother was a reading specialist, and we all started reading when we were babies, and so I was just silly, sitting in the group, irritating everybody. I just got fed up.
Okay. So when did you decide to then write Mary Quigley's Da, and why?
This was a process, this book. It started when I was an infant, and I don't recall until when I was 9 years old. I remembered the story that my grandmother had become an orphan and that she had lost an infant sister who was 4 months old. And this was a source of shame, secrecy. It was a great mystery and very sad. So I thought, that's interesting. I'd like to write that. But it wasn't until I have a nephew who's a writer who works actually in television, and he writes scripts, blah, 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 does comedy. Yeah. And he was a stand-up comedian. And in one of his acts, he heard this story, and he said, what was wrong with those people? Didn't they have enough potatoes? And he was making light of the tragedy that was in our family, but he didn't know any of the details. And I said, it made me angry. And instead of bawling him out, I said, well, of course he's going to use it. He's looking for something that's amusing, something that he doesn't understand, or something people will laugh at, but he doesn't have the information. And I had been working on finding the answers to that question, and that's when I decided that I would be much more diligent. I would make darn sure that I got that story written. I would have all the truth in that story, and that I would write a book and share it with my family.
Good. Well, I've got a little blurb here from your book, kind of set the tone. And you wrote, separated by death and necessity from their family of 10, two adolescent potato famine brothers leave New York in 1849, struggle to thrive, and eventually settle in 1852 on the Kansas-Missouri border. After surviving a famine, the cavalry in the Civil War, and 20 years of natural disasters, the talented but flawed younger brother, Joseph Quigley, destroys his family in a final and terrifying act that leaves his 6 children orphaned. So this story started with the Irish potato famine, correct?
Yes, it did.
And so you wound up having to do some fairly extensive research to complete this book, because it's set during the Civil War period and the Kansas-Missouri border wars and things like that.
Well, what really intrigued me is that my mother loves history, and she writes historical plays for community theaters and has done stuff like that. And when I was a music teacher, I would integrate student social studies with my music and turn them into plays so that to tell the story. But I learned as a child from my mother's research that on her side of the family, her first cousin was General Schofield, who'd been sent to the Kansas-Missouri border, and that he had actually trained cavalry there. And he was the one who helped Lincoln make sure that there was a solid cavalry, because
Right.
they really needed to have that in order to win the war. They could not do it without the train and without the cavalry. And I thought, really, that's my first cousin. And here's my great-grandfather who ends up on that border with his brother, with my great-granduncle. And it was just extremely intriguing. So I had to find out that history. So I read the Irish histories, and I just delved into it, because there were a lot of things in my father's culture that I wasn't in touch with until I read those histories, and I understood their attachment to land, the necessity for food, all of the comments that he would make, such as, if it weren't for bad luck, the Irish wouldn't have luck at all.
Yeah.
You know, and there were all these sayings
Yeah.
that were absolutely defined who we were. And I said, this is who I am. After reading those histories,
Yeah.
I'm the consequence of this kind of the tenacity, the drive. So I committed to learning history, and I've read over 152 history books before I wrote this story.
Yeah.
And then Ulysses Grant was my father's first cousin.
Oh.
Joseph Quigley, actually, his wife was a daughter of Mary Grant, they were from Ohio. Anyway, so, I mean, who wouldn't want to know
Yeah.
the story and see the juxtaposition of these individuals who, changed the world?
Just an aside, I think the Schofield you mentioned, because he was the cavalry Schofield who helped develop the Smith & Wesson large caliber revolvers specifically for the cavalry, and of course then the U.S. adopted the Colt instead post-Civil War,
Right.
in the 1870s, which is kind of just a little bit of a side for all you gun nuts out there. So when you did all this research, and then you started writing, do you use any type of computer editing programs and things like that?
Well, I taught English for 35 years, and
Okay.
I'm used to looking for split infinitives, parallel structure, introductory clauses without the comma, run-on sentences. So when I write, it's just inbred in me not to make errors. And my father went to a Jesuit private school, and you did not make grammatical errors, and he taught English. I actually had him as an English teacher when I was in high school.
Oh.
And so,
So they let you do that, huh?
yeah, and he kicked me out of his class, actually, when we
You
were
know,
in
the
high
thing
school.
about getting kicked out of classes.
Well, it's my mouth. I have no filters when it comes to my point of view.
Yeah.
I know who I am, I know what I believe, and that's just smart bunch of kids in the class. Dick, who was a head pharmacist for a big hospital, was very bright. He got an A, I got an A minus, but we had exactly the same we both had missed the same question.
Oh, okay.
And I said, wait a minute, Daddy. And I was supposed to call him Mr. Scott. And he said, excuse me? And he said, can you take your things and go to the office? And the next day I was in Mrs. Benjaminson's class.
Yeah.
She was great. I was glad. Anyway.
That's interesting because sitting here, age me, when I was going to school, I even remember I went to school with a guy, but last name of McKinley. His dad was the principal of the school we were in. So that was always that thing about, do you want to put the kid in the same school that their parents are teaching or
Right.
principals or whatever? But usually, at least when the schools I went to, they usually try to keep the kid out of the classes where their parents actually taught, And it was just, I guess, because they were worried about favoritism or something like that.
Yeah,
That's
well,
fast,
it worked the opposite for me.
Yeah.
And I asked him why, and he said, you could have done better. Okay, but I still got an A, and that, but that was the end of that. Anyway, but I generally, I don't And I'll tell you what, when you're using accent, spell check is just a pain.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Because you turn around and pretty soon all of your, instead of, Irish don't even have the word yes in their vocabulary.
Okay, explain. That's the first I heard
Well,
about
if you
this.
ask somebody a question and they want to answer in the affirmative, that's what Irish speak so much. They take 2 or 3 words and they don't just say yes.
Oh,
They
so-
say, it is, that it is, or they'll explain. So if you ask me what time it is, I'll tell you how to build a watch.
That's the first I've ever heard of that. That's fascinating.
Anyway, so that's what, so I don't like the grammar thing and I don't like the spell check, but when I got the book published the first time, I had a really good editor.
Okay.
And he commented on the necessity for some of the pieces I had, some of
Right.
the subplot kind of stuff that went on.
So he did some content editing
Yeah,
in
he
addition
did
to just the
content
grammar.
editing,
Yeah.
not just grammatical. And everybody makes spelling errors.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
I mean, when you type, you think that, then you write the word the, and you don't see them when
That
you read
or
it
like-
yourself.
That, or like you said, spell check decides you really wanted to use another word.
Yes,
You know.
yes, and it reduces your vocabulary
Yeah.
to a 5th grade level, and that's how that's what they want. They want it to be readable, understandable. And I say, if somebody wants to read my book and understand it,
Yeah.
let them sit with a thesaurus or a dictionary.
Well, it is true that, I use Grammarly,
Right.
which has always worked well for me. But they occasionally do come up with that little blurb that says, the word you use may not be really understood by the general public. Maybe you want to use,
Oh,
and-
really? I
oh,
did
yeah.
not know that.
Well, I'm going to sit here and do a commercial for Grammarly now. You can get a Grammarly, like a premium type thing. It's not that expensive, but it does. And plus, it starts to learn how you write somewhat. And if you write something and then you don't work on that piece for a while, you go back a few days later, sometimes it'll offer new suggestions, which is, first time it did that, I was going, what? But, there's enough of a, I guess, independent thought in these programs that they managed to build that in there. But it's true that sometimes they'll go, well, you must be writing for a dumb audience, so I don't think they'd understand this word. Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to use that word because that's the word I want to use.
But that word
yeah.
is often important to your style.
Exactly.
And when I read a really, really good book, I really analyze, what has this person done to make this
Yeah.
so much fun to read or so impacting? There's something,
Yeah.
I like books that grab you,
Yeah.
in some way. I don't like a lot of the fantasy. I call it, the writing style becomes what I call kaleidoscopic. Things plop down. It's like turning this, and all of a sudden there's a war, and then there's a conflict with these people, and then
Well,
there's a magic stone. And
I think a lot of that's because a lot of the fantasy books are written for young adults.
yes,
And so that becomes that type of writing style where, literally they're trying to get the kids into the fantasy mindset as opposed to
Right,
your book
right.
going through the whole thing about,
well, every child is
Irish,
gifted
yeah.
depending on what you bring to them at a
Right.
certain point in their life. So I say, don't dumb them down.
I agree.
Yeah.
We do have a tendency of,
Anyway,
day
I
and age, to
I
dumb things.
diverged. Excuse me.
no, not really, because it's all about writing.
Anyway, okay.
So you arranged for, who wound up publicizing?
Well,
You had several different
I had Random
publications.
House
Yeah.
at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I had a lady who contacted me, and I don't recall how I connected with her, but she called me and talked with me and said, I understand you're writing a book that sounds really interesting. It's got
Right.
a lot of history in it, a lot of genealogy. This is the thing that's, that's what's happening now.
Yeah.
And so we're very interested. And she said, why don't you send me, so I sent her a chapter. And then she said, oh, this is really can be a great book. And so get that finished, and when you're done, let me know. So I finished the book, and I sent it off. And by then, Random House had sold had bought
Yeah.
other companies and buying and selling stuff that goes on. And,
Yeah.
and I had a different publisher.
Right. No,
I
know.
had, and it was a self-publishing. And boy, they started to not nickel and dime me, but big money me to death.
Yeah.
But I wanted a book. And I think that's what happens is that people fall into that. You know, I've spent all these years of my life. I'm committed to my family. I said, I'm going to find out the truth of this story. And I'm going to find out what the pressures were on not only our Quigley family, but on all of the immigrants who come here because they're leaving because of war, they're leaving because they're starving, they're leaving because of injustice. There's always some reason why they can't stay there and thrive. And people just don't do what he did without some provocation or some reason or some defect and you can't just criticize that one person without realizing that he had many, many, many positive attributes I didn't know until I delved into it.
Well, then what made you decide to fictionalize it, though?
Because I didn't have the everyday thing. I had thousands of historical documents, and I started by making a spreadsheet.
Right.
And I started the day they stepped foot on Staten Island.
Oh, okay.
On May 3rd. And then I had contacted a gentleman who told me where those people lived in New York City on 123 Mott Street. And he believed that his grandmother was one of those children in the Joseph's siblings. And we didn't know that for sure because we didn't have the right documentation to corroborate that. But anyway, so I had that, and then I actually went through every census from 1800 to 1900 and writing down the name Quigley. And then I made a binder that had each of those members finally put together in a family unit.
Right.
I either made a family tree or I had a family group so that I could identify every Quigley in the United States of America. Because it was amazing to me where these people came from. And I discovered that there weren't that many different families. There may have been 148 names, but there were 6 families. And it was 2 generations, 3 generations. And then I started learning occupation importance. So if they were miners, that's Pennsylvania, that's, certain places. If they worked for the railroad, that was here, there, or the other place. And then I was able to start putting it together. But I just had, just literally tons of stuff.
Well, if you had to go do it again, especially with the publication side, what would you do different?
Well, I want to make this book, I want to elevate and sell this book because I think it's a very worthy story to be told.
Right.
I've dedicated my life to it. It was very cathartic to me.
Okay.
I cried all the time I wrote it because I empathized with everybody in the story, and the locusts and the skirmishes and the battles and the disease and all of the crop failures and the floods. I mean, those people really, really struggled to get through that. It's through the 1800 on the frontier, and they were getting shot at by both sides in the Civil War. They got burned out by the Union, by Senator Lane, who was a nutcake, he was a nut. And they were, they were come at all sides. And they came from a country where there was no nutrition. They've dug up mass graves in Ireland and discovered that people had scoliosis and crumbling bones, and they had for basically 800 years of any colonizing of any country is a hard thing. And anyway.
Well, yeah, and it's true that, the British treated the Celtic people and the Irish and the Scottish and everything like.
Oh, they were just
Yeah, they thought they were like
opportunities.
just
They were
barely-
opportunities,
Yeah.
and they were riffraff. Yeah. Well, anyway, I got to this other publisher, and then that publisher, at some point, they made a mistake in my book. They
Yeah.
put in the wrong year, and they put it was a Civil War year they should have written in there, and they wrote a post-Civil War year. And I said, I need this corrected. And they said, well, that'll cost $900. Well, $900, I know it's on a computer. It takes 3
Yeah.
seconds
Yeah.
to get in my manuscript and change the digit.
Yeah,
4 digits in that
Right.
number. Just change this number from a 5 to a 3.
Right.
And we've got it. And $900 you want from me. So publishing really, unless you have an established publisher who wants to pay for your book,
right.
all the rest of them are earning money off of people who don't have money. The average writer earns nothing off of writing. Only 2 out of 10 writers ever earn a nickel.
So, do you have any other projects in the works?
Yes, I've already written one. I'm fascinated by how cultures, like people under slavery or being conscripted or whatever, how they survive these situations that they were born into. And then there's the other situation in which you are born into crummy, and then a war comes. Then what do?
Yeah.
I mean, you already don't have any resources. Now you're fighting a war. And how do you do that? What happens? What would I do for my neighbors in that setting? What would I become? So I've written a story about a young girl who's a descendant of an aristocratic McGuire family, and she becomes very involved in the war herself.
Right.
She's a horsewoman.
Oh,
And
okay.
it seems like we have that. And Joseph was a horsewoman, but we have these people that, and my dad used to train horses.
Oh, okay.
He has a law degree, but he taught school.
Yeah.
But they had wagons, they had big work horses, and
Right.
they had all kinds of horses. So I have this girl who has a very large horse, and she's in the rebellion of 1641.
Oh, okay.
And the Irish Rebellion of
Right.
1641 that ushered in the 11-year wars.
There we go. Yeah.
And I really like the history. It's not fun, but it's pretty intriguing how rotten all of those lords and
Oh, yeah.
and the English and the machinations between.
So, if somebody in the viewing audience wanted to get a hold of you, how would they contact you?
Well, they can go to my website, which is www.maryjaffe.com.
Okay.
That's JAFFE.com.
Okay.
And they could buy my book there and read my blog. I have a blog about immigration,
Oh, there you go.
and it's who, what, why, when, where,
Yeah.
immigration. And it has newspaper articles from showing that the politics of today
Oh, yeah.
are identical to the politics that have always been in this country.
One quick little blurb, and we'll try to wrap this up. But people don't understand immigration law is not based on common law. Immigration law is based on whatever the government wants to do at that point in time.
At that point in
Yeah.
time. And so if there are wars with certain people,
Yeah, they don't want them in.
they don't want them.
Yeah.
And they're like chess pieces on
Yep.
in a strategy.
Exactly.
Really, they become chess pieces in a strategy.
Well, thanks for being here today. And
Well,
of course,
thank
we're
you.
going to expect you to see you at our CLAW meetings and other sponsored events. And of course, once again, I would like to thank all of our viewers for tuning into Bremerton Kitsap Access Television and viewing the Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers Artist Showcase. Of course, none of this would exist without the BCAT staff in the director's booth and on camera. Have a subject or activity you would like to showcase on BCAT? Please contact manager Colleen Michael and pick her brains as to how to fulfill your dreams. BCAT exists to support the residents of Kitsap County. This program will be broadcast Saturdays at 6 p.m. on Astound at Wave Cable and Channel 3 on Comcast, Channel 12. You can watch it also live stream at www.bcat.com at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Keep in touch with CLAW on social media for upcoming events. Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers meet on the first and third Wednesdays of every month at Spiro's Pizza on Kitsap Way in Bremerton, Washington. On the second Tuesday of each month at 7 p.m., there is the companion Kitsap Peninsula Filmmakers Group meeting at the Family Pancake House on Wheaton Way, also in Bremerton. CLAW exists to help all artists and writers to create, publish, and market their works. All creatives are welcome to meetings. CLAW and affiliated residents have some upcoming events. Check out our Facebook and meetup pages to follow us, as well as our CLAW page at www.claw.group. Affiliated authors and their work can be found on that site through links. Blue Forge Group, the umbrella nonprofit organization, ensured CLAW episodes filmed over the last 3 years are on YouTube. Query CLAW or Blue Forge, you can watch recordings of your favorite authors and creatives. Query Blue Forge Press to find the artistic works of Blue Forge published artisans, which includes myself. And of course, you've got to watch the CLAW famous Halloween and Christmas shows. I hope all the viewers have a pleasant evening and a productive week. Remember, keep reading, writing, and filming. Until next Saturday, this is Mark Miller with Kitsap Artists and Writers at Bremerton Kitsap Access Television Studios. Signing off. Good day.